Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Alan Bayliss. I'm the minister of World Baptist Church in North Somerset. This is a series about prayer, which I've entitled The Adventure of Prayer. And this one in particular, Jesus shows us how. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 17 says this. Paul says to his readers, pray continually. And I don't know about you, but when I was a youngster, I used to be puzzled about that. How can you pray continually? Can you be praying when you're sleeping, when you're eating, when you're driving? I mean, all sorts of things. And I'm not very good at multitasking, can only do one thing at a time. How do you pray continually? What did Paul mean by that? What did it look like? Then some years later, I was reflecting upon the fact that the Gospels provide us with snapshots of the prayer life of Jesus. And I thought, well, if I can understand how Jesus prayed, surely that's the role model. That's how you can pray continually. That's what it looks like. I discovered that Jesus had set prayer, special prayers, and spontaneous prayer, which I now call the prayer of the 3 S's. It's how Jesus prayed and is a model for my own prayer life, and also, I believe, for the prayer life of churches. So let me take you through the 3 S's. First of all, set prayer. One of the important reasons why Luke wrote his gospel was to disciple somebody called Theophilus, who I believe was a high-ranking official, probably of the same title and rank of somebody like Pilate, possibly a Roman governor somewhere. And when he is writing to him, you can read about it in Luke 1, verses 1 to 4, Luke is concerned that Theophilus may know the certainty of the things that he had been taught. Now, if Theophilus was to grow in his Christian faith, he needed to learn how to pray. And I wonder if the request of the disciples resonated with him. That's recorded in Luke 11 and verse 1. We read this. One day, Jesus was praying in a certain place. When he finished, one of his disciples said to him, Lord, teach us to pray, just as John taught his disciples. Well, I suggest that may well have resonated with Theophilus. But the important question today is, does it resonate with you? How does the thought of a series on prayer make you feel? Does it excite you? Or is it a case of, oh no, here we go again, another guilt trip about how I don't pray enough? Will you join me in making a commitment to prayer? My commitment looks like this. I'm committing myself through this series of sermons, not just to talk and preach and pray about prayer, but to seek personal renewal in prayer myself. Secondly, I'm committing myself to open the scriptures and to let loose biblical teaching, encouragement and rebuke among us in the series that lies ahead. And I'd like to make this a body of Christ exercise and give an opportunity for us to learn from each other. Now then, this one day when Jesus was praying in a certain place wasn't a one-off. It wasn't an isolated event. In fact, Luke starts talking about prayer right at the beginning of his gospel. He points out that Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist, was in Jerusalem on duty as a priest. An angel appeared to him. Do not be afraid, Zechariah, the angel said to him. Your prayer has been heard. Presumably prayers that he prayed years ago for a child, for a son. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you are to call him John. Luke doesn't leave it there. In chapter 5 and verse 16, he tells us that Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. In Luke chapter 6 and verse 12, one of those days, Jesus went out to a mountainside to pray and spent the night praying to God. And in Luke 9 verse 28, about 8 days after Jesus said this, he took Peter, John and James with him and went up onto a mountain to pray. Luke is making the point that prayer for Jesus was important. I think we can safely assume that Jesus would have been brought up to pray. He would have been taken to the synagogue in Nazareth, and there would have been set times for prayer. There would have been similar set times for prayer at the temple in Jerusalem, and we know from Luke's Gospel that his parents took him there. Jews at that time prayed at least 3 times a day, at sunrise, midday, and at sunset. This pattern seems to be reflected even with Daniel in the Old Testament. Daniel chapter 6 and verse 10 tells us that when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, the decree that nobody should pray to any god except Nebuchadnezzar, that Daniel went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to God just as he had done before. Back in May 1985, 35 years ago this month, in fact, I went to Sudan, and I was a guest in a home in Khartoum. I was there on behalf of something called Pontypridd and Rhondda Christian Concern. We'd been raising supplies to send out to Ethiopia. Those of you who remember it, 1985 was the year of the great Ethiopian famine. A famine famously put by the BBC correspondent as a famine of biblical proportions. I was out there to see how the aid was being used and reporting back, and the idea was then to raise some more. It was hot, and I was having trouble sleeping. But eventually I dropped off when suddenly about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, can't remember exactly the time, I was awoken by a very loud noise. Somebody had a loudspeaker and was shouting, it seemed to me, at the top of his voice. I asked later what it was that was being said, and I was told it was the call to prayer being issued from the loudspeakers at the top of the minaret of the mosque. And it said that there is only one God and his prophet Muhammad, and that it was better to pray than to sleep. Well, they meant it. You couldn't have slept through that noise. And a few moments later, I could hear the rustling of feet as the men of the area made their way to the mosque to pray. And I remember thinking, gosh, I don't think I could do that in Tonopandi. Expect people to turn out 3 or 4 times a day for prayer, especially not in the middle of the night. But it did impress me, the commitment to the set times of prayer that was being modelled. I was brought up on the daily QT, the quiet time. A bit of a one-size-fits-all approach, but I think the principle is a sound one, even if it might need tweaking in practice for different people at different times. We all go through different seasons in life, and it will look different to when you have young children at home as to when they've flown the nest and you've got more time, as it were. So the practicalities have to be worked out. What works for you? But the principle of having disciplined, set times for prayer is a good one. What about that elusive commodity called time? Well, it's a scary thought, isn't it? But we're told by psychologists, and I think it's true, that we all somehow manage to make time for those things that are important to us. Prayer was important to Jesus, and he found the time. The set times of prayer would have been important to him. But as well as set times for prayer, Jesus had special times for prayer. If you think of the set times as the foundation for prayer, then he built on that special times of prayer. He did it whenever life was hectic and busy. Now, when life is hectic and busy, we might skimp on time for prayer. Jesus did the opposite. He made more time for prayer, especially when he was busy. Mark 1 verse 35 tells this. After a busy day, very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. Luke 5 in verses 15 and 16 says this. The news about Jesus spread all the more, so that crowds of people came to hear him and to be healed of their sicknesses. But Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. And then in the account that Matthew has of the feeding of the 5,000, we read that after he had dismissed them, Jesus went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. It seems that the busier Jesus was, the more time he made for prayer. So, Jesus had special times for prayer when life got especially hectic and busy. He also made time for prayer before he made important decisions. For example, the choosing of the 12 apostles. Luke tells us in chapter 6 and verses 12 to 13 this: "One of those days Jesus went out to a mountainside to pray and spent the night praying to God. And when morning came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them." And we find Jesus at prayer before important stages in his ministry or at times of crises. There's Peter's confession of him as the Christ, Luke 9 verse 18. There's the transfiguration, Luke 9 verse 28. There's Jesus in Gethsemane, of course. For example, Matthew 26 and verses 36 to 46. And in John 17, we have a whole chapter devoted to a prayer of Jesus that we call the high priestly prayer. Jesus made time for prayer. He had those special times. And finally, the third S, spontaneous prayer. And there's an example of that in Luke 10, verse 21. We read this: "At that time, Jesus, full of joy through the Holy Spirit, said, 'I praise you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you have hidden these things from the wise and learned and revealed them to little children. Yes, Father, for this was your good pleasure.'" Turning back into the Old Testament, we find an example of spontaneous prayer with Nehemiah. We call them arrow prayers. For example, Nehemiah chapter 2 and verse 4. Nehemiah says, "The king said to me, 'What is it you want?' Then," says Nehemiah, "I prayed to the God of heaven." Someone has written this: "Cultivate the habit when walking, when driving, waiting in a bus queue, around the house. Is there any place you don't pray in? Then pray there. Pray silently, pray aloud, pray in the bath or in bed, bow your head or raise your hands. But pray, especially when you don't feel like it." Spontaneous prayer is only, I think, a valid way of praying if you've also got the set and the special times of prayer. If you think, "Oh, I'll only pray when I feel like it," you might go long periods of not praying. So there needs to be this combination, I believe, of discipline and spontaneity. And I think it's a model for us as individual Christians and as church communities. I've modelled my own prayer life on the 3 S's now for many years. And we see the same pattern in church life. A regular church meeting, praying regularly in small groups. And then there are those occasions when you have special times of prayer. Before church calls a minister to be its minister, or a church facing a big decision, it's good to call people together to pray specifically, over and above the set times, having the special times. As well as this series, The Adventure of Prayer, I'll be doing something called Adventures in Prayer as well. And that will be available on my YouTube channel as well, where I look at some examples of people praying prayers in the Old Testament and New Testament and finding out what we can learn from that. I'm writing a booklet called Getting Prayer Right, which is my own take on understanding what Jesus tells us about prayer in what we call the Lord's Prayer or his pattern prayer. And my sermons in the weeks ahead will be looking at the Lord's Prayer as well. But at the end of the day, if all we do is end up talking a lot about prayer, or if all I do is end up teaching about prayer and preaching about prayer, but don't actually pray, then all this will have been a sorry waste of time. Let's not allow that to happen. Let's make sure that through prayer, when we come out of this COVID-19 crisis, we'll be in a better place to do church again, as we are used to doing. So, can I leave that with you for now? Think about what prayer of the 3 S's looks like for you. Toy with it, experiment with it. But I believe that Jesus has modelled for us what it means, what it looks like to pray continually. Over to you. God bless, and hopefully see you next time.